Hi. Oh, hi, hello. It's good to see so many people here. Thank you all for being here. So, my name is Victoria Ajayi. I'm a senior at the Rutgers Business School. I'm majoring in business analytics and information technology with a minor in history. I am also a second-year scholar at the Institute of Women's Leadership. Today, in collaboration with the Rutgers Institute of Women's Leadership, the School of Communication and Information, and the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the School of Arts and Sciences, I am honored to present Roxane Gay, the Gloria Steinem Endowed Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies. As chair, Dr. Gay demonstrates her commitment to centering underrepresented voices with her exemplary talent and rich experience in media and storytelling. She's an internationally recognized writer, editor, and cultural critic. Her works include the New York Times bestseller books Bad Feminist, Hunger, and most recently, Opinions. She also has a newsletter, The Audacity, and once had a podcast, The Roxane Gay Agenda. Dr. Gay continues.
Someone approves.
Dr. Gay continues on making an impact as an educator. She has taught undergraduate courses that explore cultural criticisms, trauma, Black feminisms, and interactions with identity. She also encourages students through mentorship to become inspiring authors through creative writing cohorts. Roxane Gay continues to inspire me personally with the uninhibited and personal approach she takes to her writing. She's bold and self-assured in her voice, and it teaches me how to be the same with mine. I had the honor of being in the class with her, and that was an impactful experience on its own. She teaches me how to become a leader as a Black woman, trying to lead in an isolating and inequitable world, as you can imagine being a business student and being one of the few Black women business students that exist out there. And as a young woman also, with my own insecurities and anxieties, trying to make it in the frightening and confusing world. Dr. Gay will be in conversation with Edwidge Danticat, about her essay collection, We're Alone. Danticat, like Dr. Gay, began writing at an early age, and in her work she explores themes such as self-identity and self-expression. She has now authored many books, including Breath, Eyes, Memory, a Notebook Books Club selection, Crick Crack, a National Book Award finalist, and Everything Inside, a Reese's Book Club selection and National Book Critics Circle Awards winner. Danticat's essay collection, We're Alone, spurs a critical conversation on pressing issues such as environmental catastrophe, the traumas of colonialization, motherhood, and the complexities of resilience. As a leadership scholar, we learn in class the importance of listening to women's histories. And yes, it is so important to listen and learn from these histories in order to take the next step in fostering a more equitable society. It allows us to recognize the value of diverse experiences, encourages empathy, and promotes a more inclusive dialogue about the future we want to build. But in addition to this, it is important to listen to women's histories because it disrupts societal notions of what matters and what has values. You learn that women are not only an integral part of understanding the world, but an important part of understanding humanity. I hope for today that you will listen and learn. I hope that you will understand, as women, that you are a part of a collection of women with similar pains and similar challenges, and that this world will not swallow you with it. Understand that there is merit to what you say and what you feel. I am certain you will find this conversation pertinent to the myriad of events and feelings circulating around us all tonight. And if after this conversation you would like to explore more of Danticat's writing, I encourage you to look at her books outside. So without further ado, join me in welcoming our guest, Edwidge Danticat, to Rutgers.
Thank you, Victoria. That was an excellent introduction, and
I really agree with everything you had to say about how great I am. It's just facts are facts. No, but in all seriousness, it's always wonderful to see young women who stand in their own power and recognize the power and importance of their voices. So thank you for introducing us so graciously. And welcome, Edwidge, to the Rutgers campus.
Thank you.
It is a real pleasure and an honor to have you here with us today. And you are here in support of your latest collection, We Are Alone, which is an essay collection after my own heart, and it's lovely. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to read a little bit for us.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Victoria, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you, Roxane, for having me. And thank you all for coming. We'll try to get you out in time to watch the debate.
Oh, no, we will.
Unless you're doing like me, you can only take it in snippets. Then you'll watch the clips tomorrow. So I'll read just a couple of paragraphs from the end of the collection. It's from a chapter called Writing the Self. I have two daughters. One is 19 and one is 16. And during the pandemic, I would try very hard to keep them busy. So I made my oldest take an essay writing course online. And then when I saw the description in the syllabus, I'm like, oh, I want to take this course. So this is a little bit about that and what they read and one particular thing that stuck with me. During the summer of 2020, my daughter Mira took a writing class online. Taught by the writer Erica N. Cardwell, the class was called Writing the Self. Mira and I were both won over by the course description. Imagine the essay is a body of water, far-flung and teeming into the distance, and you, the writer, are alone on shore. Will you enter the water? If so, how will you swim? Or will you stand on shore as the water splashes against your ankles? I wish I could take this class, I told Mira. What I meant was that I wished I could have taken this class when I was 15. I have read most of the assigned essays and revisited some which I read out loud to Mira. We read When We Dead Awaken, Writing as Revision by the poet Adrienne Rich, where she told us that, quote, writing is renaming. We then read Audre Lorde's Poetry is Not a Luxury, where Lorde reminds us there are no new pains, we have felt them all already. In an August 30th, 1979 interview between the two women, Lorde cites her choral poem, Need, a chorale for Black women voices, which is about the frequent silence around the lives and deaths of murdered Black women and girls. She writes, how much of this truth can I bear to see and still live unblinded? How much of this pain can I use? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, it's interesting that you referenced Adrienne Rich and Audre Lorde, because they have had such an impact, I think, on a lot of women's writing. Who are some of your other influences that have brought you to this place in your writing life?
So I'll start, I was born in Haiti, so I'll start in Haiti. And I started actually reading Haitian writers when I came to the States at age 12. And I went to the Brooklyn Public Library and they had one shelf. Now I've gone back, they have a lot more. But they had one shelf and it said Les Haïtiens. And I remember I started reading Marie Vieux-Chauvet. There's the Modern Library has an edition of her, sort of like the novel she's most known for, called Amour, Colère, Folie, Love, Anger, and Madness. I started reading Gigi Dominique. I started reading Jacques Romain, who was translated by Langston Hughes. The book is called Masters of the Duke. So I was reading at that time to go back, but I started, I don't think I would have been able to write Berthai's Memory if I hadn't read Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings at 14 with a dictionary. I was just amazed that how much she revealed, coming out of a dictatorship. So there's a host of writers, but that's among some of them, and some of them I also talk about in the book, like Marquez and Baldwin and Lauren Hansberry, and among others.
You moved to the United States when you were 12, but you were born in Haiti, and so you have one foot in two different worlds, which is something that many immigrants know very well. So how did being part of two different worlds affect you and shape your writing?
Well, I mean, I think you described it so well in that essay in the New Yorker, about recent events. If you all haven't read it, the Haitian question. Roxane published an essay last week, I think, or 2 weeks in the New Yorker, about that. It's that, I mean, I think it can't but affect your writing. First of all, because, I mean, I came when I was 12, but my parents came as adults, like your parents. And in that way that, there's always a lot of family back home, and they're still living in the two places. My parents would even say, like, what would you say to people, like, because we came in 81, there was still the dictatorship, like, they still were feeling like they were under this umbrella of silence, like what you say here can affect the people back home. And so that, you're just always living it linguistically, because you're speaking Creole or French at home, and so and like the foods you're eating that other people are not eating, the mixes that you're making. So it affects the writing just like everything else that's sort of like you love and you're passionate and are haunted by. It just affects, it's just like every other experience that you have.
One of the challenging things about living outside of a country where you're from and being part of the diaspora is that the home that you return to is often not the home that you left, especially because of climate change and natural disasters. So it's both figurative and literal, the way that our countries can change. And I thought about this in particular when I was reading the essay A Rainbow in the Sky, and thinking about the long history of hurricanes and earthquakes in Haiti and the coming migrations forced by climate change, which we're now contending with here in the U.S. as well. Can you tell me what are the parts of Haiti that are gone that you most miss? And can you talk a bit about how you write about a Haiti that is constantly changing and that might even change between when you write something and publish it?
I mean, it's the physical landscape, certainly, like what I left behind is very different. When I was, under 12, we lived in Port-au-Prince, but in the summertime, my brothers and I were always joking that we knew that we're going to be put on a truck with like a bag of rice, a bag of corn, like a gallon of oil, and then my uncle would be like, see you in August, So it was like 2 months with our relatives in the countryside. And actually one of the funniest things was that my mother used to send me these dresses from New York that I would see once, and then I would go to the countryside and see all these little girls wearing my dresses. I'm like, oh, that's where that went. But then it was like less supervision. So that part of it, I mean, there are things that you could only see through a child's eye. So that when I went back to my school, I remember when I went to my school, I was like, oh my God, it's so small. But we all have that experience. I think there's that but it's accelerated when the physical landscape is changing so much. We had the earthquake that flattened even the home where I grew up, and other like landmarks around the neighborhood where I was. And now we have, these groups that are sort of pushing people out of areas that, now when I see pictures of the place where I grew up, it's either there's fighting or there's grass growing, and so many people have left. So writing, I mean, we will always write about like how we experience that place, whether it's close or from a distance, because there are people, I know artists in Haiti, like the Saint-Éloi, this family of artists who had a school that they've been driven out of, that they can't get back to. So there's the experience of feeling detached at a distance, but also there are people who are physically unable to access the places where they lived in last year too at the same time, and we're carrying all that at our dinner tables here too. It's like, what can we do? I think that's what a lot of Haitian families here are dealing with, like both of those things. You could be going about like your day and then bam, you get a call and something like you're always connected to that other thing that could happen over there.
You know, it's interesting. Haiti has figured quite heavily in a lot of cultural imaginations, and there are a lot of different narratives out there about Haiti, and few of them are flattering. And as Haitian writers, we are often writing against those narratives, not to contradict them, but simply to add our own understandings of Haiti and the world. And recently Haiti has been in the news because of Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, who have been characterized as eating cats and dogs, which is absurd, but racism can do those kinds of things. Do you feel a pressure to write against these kinds of narratives when they emerge? And it seems to happen every decade or so.
I mean, I think we're always writing with that in mind. And then the way that it manifests sometimes is I think sometimes it's sort of, it takes away some of the freedom that I think all writers should have. For example, people be like, when Breath Eyes Memory came out, people were like, why are you writing this stuff? They're already saying these terrible things about us. So I think there is, when I work with like young, like Haitian American writers, they're like, I want to write this story, but I really don't want to like add to this compilation of negative images. So that already takes away a bit of like your freedom as an artist, like because you're considering like, oh, how might my words be used against my people? So I think that's I mean, Black women writers have, you know, Alice Walker with The Men, right? Like so we have that load, and so I think that's the space like you're negotiating. But I always want to point out too to people that there's such a multiplicity of Haitian writing. Like there's so many Haitian writers in Haiti, thankfully, who are not translated, some of them who are older, some of them who are contemporary. So read the whole, like, don't just read us, but also read the writing that's coming out of Haiti, so you get a more complex picture. But I go back to this thing, you know, that Toni Morrison wrote or said at a conference about racism. Like the function of it is a distraction, like it keeps you from doing your work. And one of the things that she, like when she expanded on that, is she said that, you know, if they say you don't have a language, you spend all like 20 years trying to prove you have a language. If they say you have no art, where you could have been like really much more focused on your work. So that's the danger, like of producing against type, like to prove that you can do something. I always go back to that phrase in my mind while balancing like responding but also doing my work.
Yes, you know, it's interesting the responsibilities that writers of color and artists of color more broadly sometimes have to contend with, which is thinking about respectability politics and making sure that you're always putting your best foot forward. It's something I grappled with quite a lot when I wrote my first novel, An Untamed State, which is set in Haiti partially, and is about a kidnapping, because I wanted to write a crime novel. And I agonized over whether or not I should write the novel, and then I just thought, and I can't remember his name, but he is a white guy who writes about Boston all the time, and one of my favorite novelists, and that's why I'm so sad I'm blanking on his name. But I thought,
they make all those movies about
exactly, and I just thought he's not sitting around worrying about how this is going to reflect on Boston, and so maybe I should take a similar approach. And I've tried, but it's interesting to think about the burdens of representation sometimes. And speaking of burdens, I read in a Bomb interview that you resolved not to talk about things like exile or motherhood as anxieties, but instead as concerns or hauntings. And I thought that was really interesting because those are the kinds of things that tend to linger. And so what is haunting you now?
I mean, this whole thing with Springfield, and now that's moving to Pennsylvania, to a place called Charleroi, I would say, but they say Charleroi. And it just seems to be such a strategy. And I'm worried about this debate tonight for that reason. I feel like it's going to get more air. And every news thing I watch, when they talk about the election now, we're in it. You know, and at the same time, Haiti has some real problems, right? So that's a haunting to me, and I'm thinking about, like, I'm 55 years old. I'm still thinking about things that happened to me when I was 12 years old that's related to the news, you know, when they said we all had AIDS, when kids were beating us up, were calling us names. I'm thinking about, like, the next generation of kids, and some of them who have traveled, they haven't just come from Haiti, some of them. Some of them have, you know, might have been born in Chile. They might have gone through the whole Darien Gap on foot, 10 countries with their families. They might have seen horrible things already, and now have to contend with that, with bomb threats. And so that to me is to me haunting, not in a way like, oh, I want to go write about it, but it's just kind of like, as a parent, as a Haitian, that really, like, haunts me. And I think sort of, I wanted to try in that conversation, it was also with a wonderful writer you should read, Evelyne Trouillot, who wrote a book called Rosalie la Femme, which was translated as The Infamous Rosalie, about, and it's one of the few books in Haitian literature that's set, like, during the revolutionary period from a woman's point of view, from a point of view of midwife. So we were having this conversation, and I don't like the idea of, like, problemizing, like, daily life things, like mothering, or just the fact that if other people didn't problematize it for us, you think, like, yes, I'm an immigrant, I'm here, there's some differences, and literature can rise out of that, but I didn't want those things. Also, if you're a mother, like, your children will eventually read that you're like, oh my God, my children stopped me from this. You know, I felt like my children, like, enriched my life in a way that was good also for the writing.
You know, that's interesting because oftentimes culturally we have kind of restrictive narratives around motherhood as a burden, as a challenge. There's nothing harder than parenting, which may well be the case.
It is hard. It
seems pretty hard.
Yeah.
Like, you have to keep them alive.
I was actually, when my oldest turned 18, I was like, I managed to keep her alive. We fed her, like, and she's like a nice person. Yeah.
Yes, and she is a very nice person, which is a credit to both her and you. The title of your new collection, We're Alone, feels like a statement that is both certain and uncertain within the context of the collection as a whole. Can you talk a little bit about this phrase and its origins in the Chassagne poem that you mentioned in your preface, and what insight it gives us into this world that we're living in now?
You know, when I decided to go with this title, and I would tell people, they're like, no, we're never alone, our ancestors are with us, you know, and I believe in that very strongly. But the title comes from this poem. I had gotten this book from a friend of Haitian poetry from the 1700s to like 1930. And I started reading through it, and some of the names I recognized, some of them I didn't. And then I came across this one poem called Shore, and for some reason it lingered with me. It was like about someone it's in the afterword of, like, the appendix of the book, both in French and then in translation. But I had the translation, and I kept wondering, I was like, I wonder, like, how he wrote it, like what the original words were. And I was on this kind of quest for it. And then finally I thought, like, Regine Chassagne, who's in Arcade Fire, and I'm like, she's a Chassagne. I wonder if she knows this Chassagne. And it turned out it was her grandfather. And he was this writer who was arrested because he worked in a press, and he was arrested for having in his possession what they call contraband literature. And he was taken to Fort Dimanche, which is like a dungeon prison of the Duvaliers, but the father especially. And he died there in 1978. And he has an unfinished novel, actually, that his son still has. And then so they sent me Regine sent me a screenshot of that, of the original poem. And like a super nerd, I was like, I think I cried. But it was very different. The translation was very loose. You know, they said traduire, c'est trahir, like to translate is to betray. And in this case, it was very like an interpretive translation, but it was kind of like having his voice, this idea. So that evoked for me this idea of being alone with a writer. Like it's more about the intimacy that comes from that. Because the first book, like I grew up with storytellers, people who told wonderful stories who were very like performative, but I was super shy. And I remember when I was given a book and I just went in the corner with it by myself, and I felt like that feeling for me was like comparable to that of watching people tell a story. But I'm like, oh, I'm alone with this thing. Like I didn't understand it. I could access it whenever I want. And to this day, when I read something really intimate that someone has published, I feel like, oh, they trust me with this really secret stuff. Like I always felt like it's just for me. Like I'm alone with them in that way. So that's the origin of it.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting is that a lot of times when people hear "we're alone," it's, as you say, they think it's a bad thing. And there's an intimacy to the title once you really get into the essays that makes you recognize that it's not a bad thing. And you know, one of the other characteristics that really stood out to me about this collection is 8 essays, and they're all interesting and deeply researched, deeply knowledgeable, and deeply felt, which I thought was a very pleasant, for lack of a better word. It was just like a lovely balance of things. So how do you go about putting together a collection like this? Where do you start, and how do you know when, okay, this is it, this is all I have to say about We're Alone?
Well, I'd be curious to hear your process. So initially, I think you look and you're like, oh, I have a few things. It's like a story collection where you're like, I have some things, maybe there's enough for a book. And then you realize, because they're all coming from the same person, the same mind, like some of it has repetitions, and then you have to kind of carve those out. And I like, for me, like it was, like I like the 8, right? Because then you could have part 1 and part 2, and there was a lot of blending. Like there were a lot of collaging of different essays, and when I was putting it together, I came across, I mean, it existed before, but I wasn't super aware of it, something called a braided essay. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's what I want to do. So I started braiding. And that's really how this one came together. And as you know, some people make a decision like, I'm not adding a thing. I added a lot of things, and I took out a lot of things. But at some point, you're just like, okay, there's some symmetry there. There's a structure. There's something that guides someone from one to the next one. So how do you put yours?
I think in a similar way, it starts with just taking a look at what I have and recognizing, oh, there is a body of work here. And so I start to look for thematic connections and really that sense of connective tissue, so that for readers going through it, they'll know that I wrote all of the essays and that there's a reason why I'm putting this particular set of essays together. And I did that with certainly Bad Feminist and most recently with Opinions. And with Opinions, I was like, well, I've been publishing opinion essays for so long. Surely I have enough for a book, because I'm 8 years behind deadline on my next book. And so I was like, let me throw my publisher a bone. And then I looked and I realized, well, perhaps this is why I haven't finished my book, because I've been writing all of these essays. And so it was also very interesting to revisit them and to see what has changed, because with opinion writing, you're often writing to the news cycle, and there's a sense of immediacy, and the world is changing at a breathtaking clip. And so it was interesting to see which ones held up and which ones didn't. I actually did go in and tinker with a few things myself, because I just thought, I can't have people thinking I don't know what happened in the 10 years since I published this essay. So it really is just taking a step back and looking to see what kind of rises out. And I did leave some pieces out, of course, and maybe they will find a home in something else later, but it just starts with figuring out, what am I going to do here? And I just started with the title. I just knew, right or wrong, I was like, I'm going to call this book Opinions.
I mean, one of the things too, I thought having one of the advantages to collecting them yourself, I was like, if I drop dead tomorrow, I don't want them to someone to just pile everything to be like, uncollected essays, and I would be like hunting them from the grave. Like, you should have taken this one out.
Yeah, it's always good when you can do it yourself.
Yeah.
You wrote a beautiful essay, really a series of vignettes called They Are Waiting in These Hills, and in it you offer reflections on a number of writers, some of whom you already mentioned, that are very influential. And I thought the Baldwin vignette was particularly interesting, given his 100th birthday this year, and the exercise that he engaged in that 1960 address at San Francisco State. As just the thought exercise, and with the knowledge of Baldwin's larger point, if you were asked to repeat this, what kind of novel might you pretend to write in front of an audience?
I think probably like maybe a choral novel, like a polyphonal type of novel, because now when I was I did my MFA at Brown at the time, a little bit right before the internet was ushering in, and they used to do this thing called hypertext, and where people would write novels together, and so it'd be interesting. I'm thinking like in this age of AI, like recently the New York Times had that thing with the writer Curtis. I'm forgetting her last name, but
Sittenfeld?
Sinfield, yes. And where the AI wrote one story, and she wrote, I swear I got it wrong, because I thought the AI wrote like what she wrote, and they ask you to guess, but I think it would be interesting in this age, like to actually have a bunch of people in a room and see, like have them all write about the same event. I think that would be fascinating. And also we're in a period, right, like everything is unprecedented, right? Like even this, we're talking about climate change, like you're looking at, Asheville, North Carolina, like I've been there, and I can't even believe the images I'm seeing, just as I couldn't believe when I was looking at the Bahamas and there were sharks in people's living rooms, right? And so it would be interesting, like to see like a group novel, and there are writers who've done it, like you do different voices, but to see a bunch of people in a room write a novel together, maybe that's a class craft thing.
I mean, now I'm going to think about making my students do that in my essay writing class.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it is interesting to see how the world is becoming so unrecognizable, because especially with Asheville, it's in the mountains.
Yeah.
In general, mountains
Right?
don't flood, but I guess they do now.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to try and figure out how we keep up with all of the changes of the world. You mentioned AI, and as writers, I think we're going to be increasingly asked how we feel about it, et cetera, which is like, we're writers, so you've already answered your own question.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you think about the place of AI in the world of creativity? Does it have a place in the creative world?
I mean, I don't know, like when you're teaching, one of the things like when I started teaching, like I'm teaching at Columbia right now, they said, well, you have to tell them something. You can't just you have to say, whether you say, yay, use AI, or don't use AI, you have to give some guidance. And I always say, like, well, the most important thing about what we're doing is what uniquely you have to contribute, right? So I think there's probably going to be more cultural production done by AI, but I think what's singular about what you have to say and what I have to say is that it comes from us, right? And I think of AI as like a pool of other people's creativity that they're being sued over anyway. So you might, and it might be like really worse for people who are just starting out, because you and I kind of already know our voices, we already know what we say, we already know our thematics. But if you're just starting and your source is AI, how will you even know like what is unique about your voice?
Voice is something that's very interesting for writers, and when you're very lucky, you do figure out what your voice is and how to best use it. And one of the questions that I'm most often asked is, how do you find your voice? And I tend to start with that you don't have to find it, it's already there, you just have to figure out how to use it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in your classes, when you're teaching creative writing, how do you think about voice, and how do you encourage students to figure out how to use their own voices?
Yeah, I'm not teaching creative writing right now, but when I was in the past, I think sometimes people, especially writers when they're starting out, they're afraid, like they want permission to use the voice, and sometimes they're haunted by all kinds of things like people who told them they couldn't do it, or things they were told they couldn't say. I always say, trust that you have a very unique thing to say, that it only will come from you, and the way you, like, I was one of those, like when I was in college, I didn't show anybody my writing, but I was working at it, and part of it was that I was afraid they would just shut me down, right? And so I was very protective of my writing. So I mean, I agree with what you're saying, like the voice is already in you, and sometimes people feel like they need permission to let it out, or they have to allow themselves to let it out, and stop looking at sort of what other people are doing, and because sometimes that's you might be in the class with someone who's taking all the workshops, who knows all the lingo, and then it's like it's your first one and you feel intimidated. But just trust that you have something to say that is unique, that will only come uniquely from you.
In another essay, This Is My Body, you're writing about shootings and our complex and sometimes devastating usage of food as a tool of torture and death, and also about part of your job as a writer, which is to wrestle with mortality. And this has been on my mind for a lot of reasons, and I'm hoping you can share with us a little about what you've learned about your obligations as a writer, and how do you wrestle with mortality on the page?
So this essay, This Is My Body, it's a braided essay, but it starts so I was in a mall in Florida, and suddenly started hearing like gunshots, explosions, and so I thought, this being America, it was 2018, I thought I'm in a mass shooting, and then everybody else in the mall did too, so we're all running, I leave my car, and then it turns out it was some kids who were blasting the sounds. They'd somehow hacked the speaker in the mall, and so it was a hoax. But I was behind, I ran. I didn't know I could run so fast. I ran and I hid behind this bush where I was not visible, but I could see. And then I was like, oh my gosh, if this is my last day on earth. And so the essay kind of all these things that run through about mortality. And my mom had passed away like 3 years before that experience, and that had also kicked off me thinking about mortality, and also like what it means to die when you have young children, what it means to die when you're older, and all of that, and mothers who, like Yolande Jean, who was a woman who was kept in captivity basically at Guantanamo because she was a Haitian asylum seeker who had HIV, and Guantanamo really was created as a place of detention. It was tried on Haitian refugees in the 90s, and one of the women who was held there was Yolande Jean, and in her last, she was in a hunger strike, and when she thought she was dying, she wrote this beautiful letter to her children. So then I then started, my mother when she was dying kept a cassette, and I didn't find it until after she died. In the cassette she would say nice things about us, nice things like that Haitian parents don't usually say in your face. She said
Never.
Yes, exactly. She said some very lovely things, but her closing was like, on my funeral, you better wear a hat and some closed-toed shoes, like no sandals. And then she told me where she had $500 in the freezer and things like that. But that gave me, I felt like when I was listening, I was like, she's parenting me from the grave. Wow. Haitian parents really parent. They'll parent you after they die. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, that got me. I started keeping a notebook for my girls, like with specific things for them. I used to think, like, they'll have the books, they'll read the essays, they'll know, but then I started keeping, like, that's the way I thought, like, a more intimate sense of mortality, like the family, was to just address them, some specific things to their personality, to that stage of their lives.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that Haitian parents will parent you in this life and the next, which is true because my mom is always telling me Haitian parenting is forever. And because I'm almost 50 years old and she's all up in my business every single day. Do you find that you parent that way as well? Forever?
Well, my daughter's now, like, I'm teaching across the street where my daughter goes to school. So, and then my, like, Haitian mother friends are like, #goals. You get to go to college with your child. I mean, she's okay. My daughter. I mean, she visits. I mean, we were gauging. We're like, if we never see her, then she's mad that I'm here. But we see her regularly.
Oh, good.
But my young one she's like, I'm not going to tell you where I go to college because you'll get a job there. So I do #Haitian parenting, yes.
You often engage with the blend of history and imagination or reality and fantasy in your writing, and this comes out quite a lot in your fiction, but in these essays we can also see that you play with these themes in your nonfiction, especially in Chronicles of a Death Foretold, which navigates assassination and prophecy, particularly with regard to Jovenel Moise. And so, why was this story so interesting to you and this idea of prophecy?
Well, one of the things I felt like when Jovenel Moise was the president of Haiti, he was assassinated in 2021. There was a moment where a previous assassination attempt, but it was like the mall shooting, a kind of hoax that was organized by the people around him, who arrested all these innocent people, who said that they were they were going to assassinate him, but then those people who said that, who was like the security around him, ended up being involved in or allegedly involved in his assassination. So there was an element of it there was something so Marquezian, like Marquez, about that whole, because he had said he did a speech after that sort of like arranged, like fake assassination attempt that happened right before Carnival, where he said, "You will not assassinate me, I will be stuck in your throat," right? Ma coquille na gorge, like. And so, and then every time, like when people talk about Haiti now and they say, since the assassination of the president, I'm like, he is stuck in that was kind of like a one prophecy that he had. In the post-life, like he still trails the story of the country. But then there was this very interesting woman who was going around Port-au-Prince, that my mother-in-law, who's very into YouTube, has kind of introduced me to through YouTube. This woman went to meet him to tell him that he was going to be assassinated, and she tried like 3 times. Like at a funeral he went to, she was taken away, and then she went on the media, and so there was so much said already about the assassination. I wanted to approach that through that perspective of a kind of almost fictional telling of like a Marquez type of story, and sometimes when you're reading something at the same time, and I was like, this is kind of like the plot of the Marquez, the Chronicle of a Death Foretold, where someone is being told that they're going to die constantly, but nobody is paying attention until the act, and even after, in case in Jovenel Moise's case, even after people like his brother were going, oh yes, we thought that he might die. Even friends of his said, like, he told me he thought he would die. And to approach it like on this level of like a story, to me that was fascinating to see sort of the fantastical in this really massive event for the country.
What are you working on next?
I'm working on a novel right now. I'm editing, and it's one of those cases where, when you finish, I'm sure you felt like you're like, oh, I know I'm just going to turn it in and they're going to say it's brilliant and they're going to publish. But then after and I recommend this to those of you who write, you put it away and you're like, oh, it needs more work. So I'm editing a novel right now.
Excellent. I know that our audience will have questions, so if you have a question, please throw your hand up and you will get an answer. Don't be scared.
Oh, it was, so after the earthquake, about maybe 20 days or so after the earthquake, when I went back to Haiti, and there were places like, that's a distorted view of the child's eye, but when I remember going to my grandmother's house, which was a wooden house in Liugan, which I had gone as an adult, but there, just to see, that was it wasn't a concrete house, like a lot of the concrete houses fell, and then that house was there, but it's the opposite of that feeling of then going to my school, and it's like my school felt small. That house felt really big. I felt like I was a child there, and I was like, I think it was part of the gratitude of seeing it standing, that made it seem even bigger, but also things that had fallen away. But it's a similar experience of I think it's just like you were smaller in the place, and then memory also expands things, right? Like if you haven't been back for a while, you're just thinking of how it was, like how you were there in that place. But going to my school as an adult to speak and like that, I was like, that's like a one-story house, like basically. That to me was like the most striking of that. I'd heard people say it, but like going in my 20s to where I went to school when I was a girl.
Yeah, it's always interesting how space and dimension can be changed by aging.
Yeah.
And realizing.
And you don't know that it would, you don't believe that it really will until you've experienced it. All right, thank you. So Sunrise Sunset is a story about really dementia, like a parent experiencing dementia with and so a lot of us at our age, we're about 6 years apart, you start seeing your parents age, like from going, I remember for me it was like a big chance to see like my parents, my uncles, going from these giants, again this thing of space in my life to sort of being vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And I started seeing some of my parents' friends who are much younger, and the panic of losing your memory. So I wanted to do that, to talk about that through the generational thing, but also that generational thing that happens where the parents tell their children, like this mother is always telling her daughter, you just don't know how lucky you are. This idea of like how she grew up versus all the sacrifices she's making. It's the same, there's Ana Menendez, a Cuban writer, has a story called We Came All the Way from Cuba So You Could Dress Like This. So that whole thing, which encapsulates this idea of sacrifice, I wanted to also capture in that story and through the generations. And for me, like when I was working through that story, I was thinking, because it alternates points of view, and I was thinking, wow, if the mother could be the daughter's part and the daughter could be the mother's part, they'd really get along fine.
It's so well done. So well done.
Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So when I think of feminism, like when I was at Barnard, it's like I was getting introduced to like formal feminism, right? And back then I was like, I'm a womanist, like that was my, the Alice Walker definition. And when I was getting introduced to like formal feminism, and that's like theoretical feminism, and when what you're taught in classrooms, I started looking back and I was thinking, man, I knew a lot of feminists in Haiti. Like I knew a lot of these women, especially in that era of the dictatorship, like where the men were disappeared and the women had to hold up the fort and all different, class strata, because there were men from all different, social classes who were in the Duvalier's prison. So the women had a really big, central roles. And from women who were Madame Sarah, who were selling in the market, to women who then had to like figure out how to get their whole families to migrate, So I realized that I had these models in my life who were living a feminism, like a womanism, a feminism, who were just really, what we call the potomitan. It's like the middle pillar of the society, and sometimes we're not credited so much. But yeah, that helped me kind of formalize this idea. I mean, I knew the women were, even though they weren't treated, especially based on class, right? Like if they were poor women, they were treated a certain way. But I brought those living models of those feminists into the books that I was reading. And then things like when you start learning in feminism, you learn about the crow, like the woman who's unaccounted for, who's persecuted. It's like, I know that woman, I knew she lived next door. And so I was able to kind of bring that experience here through those women in my life. And maybe it's something you can chime in too. So when I'm starting, I know the difference between the fiction and the nonfiction. For the nonfiction or for the essays, there's I want them. It's something. There's a more immediate, an immediacy to it. Like I want to get that down in a certain way. For example, when I was writing my memoir, when Brother, I'm Dying, it's about, I was pregnant with my daughter and my father was dying from a lung disease and my uncle was in immigration prison. So I'm like, I would only write in nonfiction, because I wanted, there was an urgency to it and I wanted my story told in a certain way. And fiction, for me, takes longer. Even if you have an idea, the shorter fiction, like that story that we were talking about, I think I did so many versions of it, but I had to put it down sometimes and go back to it with renewed experience, with a little more living. But the nonfiction, it doesn't pour out, it still requires research, it still requires a lot of work, but there's always an urgency to it. But I think you have to sometimes let the genre choose the subject too, and to figure out how it has to do also with how you work, right? And maybe to go from the genre that comes easiest to you, start with that, and then you can always transform. If that's nonfiction, you can always transform later into fiction.
My general writing process tends to be the same regardless of genre. And it's not that much of a process, in that I tend to do most of my composition in my head, and I'm very fortunate to retain it. And so when I'm finally ready to sit down and write, it seems like I write fast, but I tend to say that I write fast and I think slow. And because if I'm sitting down to write something, I'm ready. I know what I'm going to say, I'm one and done. I do, of course, edit and so on, but I know what I want to say, and so I'm doing whatever I need to do to get there. And that can be not only I'm thinking and composing in my head, but researching until I reach the limits of knowledge that I need, and then going back when I reach the limits of what I've learned. And those two things work in tandem for me to really know, okay, this is what I want to say, especially for nonfiction. For fiction, I'm just making things up, and I love that. And so I just allow myself to make things up, and I tend to ask myself a lot of questions. What more? What else can happen? what's the worst thing I can think of? And then I'm like, what's worse than that? And so I just keep trying to push myself, because one thing I'm always trying to do is, I hope that you always will recognize my work, but I hope that it's also better than the last thing you read. And so I'm always thinking of ways I can challenge myself, where I can process some of the previous criticism I may have received and apply it to my work. And, the other part of it is just making the time. There's oftentimes people want like a formula. They want a magic trick, and there is actually no magic trick. You have to sit down or stand if you're at a standing desk, but you have to put yourself in front of whatever you use to write, and then you just have to sit there and do the writing as consistently as possible. It doesn't necessarily have to be every day, though I do write every day, and that's what keeps me sort of doing it, because writing is a muscle. You have to keep it worked out. But even if you're doing it once a month, then do it once a month. And make those appointments with yourself for writing and put them in your calendar the same way you put a meeting with your professor, with your dissertation chair, whatever. You have to respect your writing time, because I promise you no one else will. Everyone will try to disrespect that time. Oh, it's just writing time, can't you? No. And so make sure that you respect your writing time as fiercely and protect it as fiercely as possible. The most successful writers are incredibly selfish about their writing time, and they're proud of it, and I aspire to that.
Yeah, merci en pile. So for me, when my side of the family, like with my uncle, when my uncle passed away, and when we lost like the home that I grew up in the earthquake, and now it's also taken over by the armed groups that were that area. So I kind of like despaired. I'm like, because I never wanted to go to Haiti and stay in a hotel. Like, that's not what I want to take my daughters to. But I was lucky. I married a wonderful man from Lecay, and his mom was living half the time in Lecay and half in Miami. So then we had a place to go, and we also went back for things like, there's a film school in Jacmel where I used to teach in the summer, do workshop in the summer, so we would go to Jacmel. And so for me it was very important, and I'm glad that I had that opportunity, because if I didn't have like a direct place to go in that intimate way, it would have been harder to introduce that to my girls. But since we started going since they were very, very young, and I wanted them to think of it as any other place. It's a place that you have roots in, but it could be like any other, I didn't want them to have that sort of exceptionalism like this that some people have about Haiti, like it's so dangerous, so I wanted them to go, and we used to go. We would sometimes went at Christmas, we went in the summer all the time, and now they do that immigrant thing where you speak to them, and like first generation thing where you speak to them in Creole, they'll speak back in English, but their Creole was really good for a while, and we'd be startled when we would go and they were speaking to the children. And I was lucky that they got to go to a rural, they were in Port-au-Prince sometimes, but they got to a rural area. Actually, I remember once we were in a hotel in Port-au-Prince, we ran into your dad, and my daughters were like, "You've been keeping this from us?" Like we were at the Caribbean. Because we would always go like in the country, and they were like riding donkeys. So like that, like I think, it's there are so many, like when we lived in Miami, there were so many people who bemoan the fact that, for example, they couldn't, now this situation, they can't send their kids for the summer, or they can't send them to, like you got to go, for, and that was, I think, a really valuable way to keep that connection. And of course in our homes, with the food, with the music, with with also, I think, to introduce the reality, to have them like work with organizations. Like we would go with families, but we went with this organization we both know, Hope for Haiti, where the girls volunteered, and so to just keep that connection. And we haven't been able to go for a while because of the situation, but it's very that was a really wonderful way. But the thing is, and then I'll wrap it up. A lot of, like in Haitian American households, yours was not like that, but there's always, because your family always had the back and forth, but there's this, and it sounds like you had that, where the people, like your parents were like, Haiti's the greatest country, and it's wonderful, and they would talk about it in this wonderful way. But if the children say, I want to go, they're like, not now. and then the thing beyond that now never came for a lot of people. But we're, hopefully, things will get better.
They will. I'm not an optimist, but things always get better. These things are cyclical, and I want this entire next generation. We did get to go to Haiti during the summers, and we were very lucky. Part of it was like, get out of our hair, go do something, go learn some French, go learn some Creole, and it was wonderful. I have nothing but good memories, and I just, my fondest hope is that other people will be able to send their children. Because it was very safe. My parents would literally just stick us on an airplane and tell us not to talk to any blah. And wait till we got to the plane, and wait till we get to the airport and wait at the gate, and it was always fine. So I think it's going to get better again. It always does. And thank you for these amazing questions and for coming out tonight. Edwidge Danticat. The book is called We're Alone, and if you need extra copies, they're for sale up front.